Marcus adjusted the collar of his plain shirt as he stepped into the courthouse. It was an old building with tall wooden doors, echoing halls, and the faint smell of dust and coffee. The benches in the hallway were filled with people waiting for their turn. Some whispered nervously, while others scrolled on their phones, trying to distract themselves. Marcus, calm and collected, sat quietly, his hands folded over a slim folder he carried. He wasn't nervous. He had been in many courtrooms before, but this time was different. He wasn't here as a prosecutor. He was here as a simple man, dealing with what should have been a small traffic matter. When his name was called, Marcus stood up with quiet dignity. He walked toward the courtroom, his tall frame commanding attention. Inside, the air was tense, as though the walls themselves knew that fairness wasn't always guaranteed here. At the bench sat Judge Harrison, a man in his late 60s, with thinning gray hair and sharp glasses perched low on his nose. He had a reputation for being strict, but beneath that, there were whispers of bias, whispers that he often treated people differently depending on who they were. Marcus stepped forward and said politely, "Good morning, Your Honor." His voice was calm and steady, but the judge didn't even look up from his papers at first. When he finally glanced at Marcus, his eyes narrowed. He let out a soft, dismissive sigh, the kind that spoke louder than words. It was the same sigh he hadn't used for the earlier cases, when younger white defendants had stood before him. The judge tapped his pen against the desk and said sharply, "So you're Marcus Brown. Late on your registration, driving in a restricted lane, and failing to show proper documents. Quite a list for someone like you." The phrase "someone like you" hung in the air, and though it wasn't shouted, everyone in the room felt the sting of it. A couple of people in the back shifted uncomfortably. Marcus kept his posture straight. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I actually have the documents here. The renewal notice was delayed in the mail, and I brought the paperwork to explain." But before he could finish, the judge waved his hand impatiently. "Excuses. Always excuses. You people never take responsibility. That's why our roads are a mess." His tone was firm, dripping with arrogance. The clerk at the side looked down, pretending to write something, but her stiff shoulders showed she had heard every word. Marcus took a slow breath. He had faced harsher words in his life, and he knew the power of staying calm. He placed his folder gently on the podium and said, "If I may, Your Honor, these documents will show that I've complied. I also paid the renewal fee in advance. It was just an error in processing." The judge leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Isn't that convenient? Always ready with a story, aren't you? Tell me, why should I believe you when you can't even follow the simplest law about vehicle registration? What does that say about your respect for the law?" The courtroom fell silent. The earlier cases, minor speeding tickets and parking violations, had been handled with quick warnings, light fines, even a laugh or two. But now, the judge seemed determined to make an example of Marcus. Marcus nodded slowly. "Respectfully, Your Honor, the law also allows for explanation and fairness. I am simply asking for that." The judge's eyes hardened. "Fairness," he repeated, almost mocking the word. "Fairness is you paying for your mistakes like everyone else. You think you're different? You think dressing in that clean shirt makes you more responsible? I've seen enough." He slammed his hand lightly on the desk. "Fine, $500. Payable immediately. Next case." Gasps filled the room. For a simple registration issue, $500 was unheard of. Most people had been fined $50 or $75 at most. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his calm expression never breaking. Inside, he knew this was more than about documents. It was about judgment, not just by law, but by the man sitting in that chair. Marcus opened his wallet, pulled out his card, and said softly, "May I have a receipt, Your Honor?" The judge chuckled, a harsh sound that echoed off the wooden walls. A receipt? Planning to frame it on your wall as a trophy? Or maybe you don't even have the money and just want to buy time. People like you are always looking for shortcuts. Marcus's eyes met the judge's for the first time, steady and firm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply said, "I always keep records, sir." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Something in the way Marcus spoke, with quiet authority, made the judge shift slightly in his chair, though he quickly covered it with another smirk. The bailiff processed the fine. Marcus took his receipt, tucked it carefully into his folder, and turned to leave. As he walked out, a hush followed him. People on the benches looked at him with a mix of pity and admiration. They had seen injustice before, but rarely had they seen someone face it with such grace. At the door, Marcus paused. He didn't look back at the judge, but he spoke clearly enough for the clerk and those close by to hear. "Thank you for your time, Your Honor. I will make sure to stay compliant moving forward." His tone was respectful, almost too respectful, and it left an odd taste in the air. The judge sneered and muttered under his breath, "Next time, it'll be worse." But Marcus walked on, shoulders straight, footsteps steady, leaving behind the heavy silence of the courtroom. For him, it wasn't about the money. It was about principle. He had faced the weight of unfairness, and while others might have shouted or broken down, he had chosen calm strength. What no one in that room knew, not the judge, not the clerk, not even the people who whispered in the benches, was that Marcus had walked into that courtroom wearing two identities. One, a regular man with a small violation. The other, a respected federal prosecutor who had stood in higher courts than this judge could ever imagine. But Marcus had chosen silence that day, not because he lacked the power to speak, but because he believed patience often revealed truth at the right time. And as he stepped out into the sunlight, receipt in hand, the wheels of fate were already turning. The judge had written his fine with arrogance, but soon he would discover just how costly that arrogance would be. After leaving the courthouse, Marcus walked slowly to his car. The city streets were busy, with people rushing to work, buses honking, and vendors calling out their morning specials. Marcus's mind, however, was focused. He wasn't upset about the fine. He knew that, in time, the situation would unfold exactly as it should. His calm demeanor was not ignorance, but strategy. He understood that sometimes, the world's injustices revealed themselves in ways that would surprise even the most arrogant of people. As he got into his car, he thought about the judge's expression, the smirk, the dismissive gestures, the words full of prejudice. Marcus had encountered bias before, but this was a new kind of arrogance. The judge believed that power came from the bench, that a single fine could define a person. He didn't realize that true power came from knowledge, experience, and the ability to act when the time was right. Marcus's role as a federal prosecutor had taught him patience, precision, and how to let people underestimate him until the moment was perfect. He drove through the city streets, past familiar buildings, and thought back to the courthouse. The incident had happened quickly, but every detail was clear in his mind. The judge's eyes had narrowed the moment Marcus had spoken calmly. He had tried to assert control, to remind Marcus of the power imbalance. But Marcus had remained steady. That small act of composure would later turn out to be crucial. At the office, Marcus placed his folder on his desk and sat down. The quiet hum of computers and phones created a steady background rhythm. His colleagues were busy with cases, paperwork, and meetings. Marcus knew that his professional reputation had been built over years, one case at a time, and it was one of the few things in life that truly mattered to him. He looked at his reflection in the window and allowed a small, confident smile. The day's challenge was far from over, and the next steps were already forming in his mind. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Judge Harrison continued his morning schedule. He seemed pleased with himself, convinced that his courtroom had demonstrated authority over Marcus. He went through the rest of his cases quickly, giving lighter fines, issuing warnings, and maintaining the appearance of a fair and just judge. But internally, he felt satisfaction at having taught a lesson to someone he had perceived as challenging. The judge didn't know that the man he had just fined was no ordinary citizen. Back at Marcus's office, he opened his laptop and began reviewing case files. Each click and keystroke was deliberate, as if the world had slowed for him. Marcus had always believed in preparation, in using knowledge to influence outcomes. In his career as a federal prosecutor, he had handled complex cases involving major corporations, high-profile fraud, and critical investigations. The skills that allowed him to navigate those high-pressure situations would also serve him in this personal encounter. He made a phone call to his assistant, who immediately recognized the tone in his voice. "Morning, Marcus," she said. "How was the courthouse?" "Interesting," Marcus replied calmly. "Set up a meeting with my team this afternoon. We have some follow-ups to discuss, and I need all documents regarding the recent municipal rulings in that district." His words were deliberate, precise, and professional. Even in this personal matter, Marcus approached it with the same focus as a federal case. As the morning passed, Marcus received several calls from colleagues and acquaintances who had learned about the fine. Some expressed sympathy, others curiosity. But Marcus responded with the same measured calm. He didn't complain, didn't make excuses, and didn't reveal more than necessary. His reputation as a federal prosecutor and a person of composure meant that people listened carefully to every word. Across town, the courthouse atmosphere had shifted subtly. Some of the clerks and staff whispered among themselves, recalling the unusual way Marcus had handled the interaction with the judge. They had seen many cases, but rarely had someone maintained such dignity in the face of clear bias. The quiet admiration grew slowly, unnoticed by Judge Harrison, who continued his routine, oblivious to the subtle erosion of his perceived authority. By afternoon, Marcus had gathered his documents and prepared a formal review request. He knew the steps to challenge fines, especially when they appeared discriminatory. In his experience, evidence, documentation, and timing were essential. He drafted a clear, respectful letter, citing his compliance with vehicle registration laws and providing proof of payment and timely submission of documents. Every sentence was crafted with precision, every detail supported by facts. Marcus understood that fairness often required the right presentation, not just truth alone. When he submitted the letter to the clerk of courts, he noticed some curious glances from the staff. His professional presence and calm confidence were unusual in the typical traffic fine cases. The clerk handed him a receipt for submission, commenting politely, "Your attention to detail is impressive." Marcus nodded quietly, acknowledging the remark without distraction. He was aware that appearances mattered, and that his actions, more than words, would speak volumes. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison continued to conduct his daily proceedings, but a subtle unease began to creep in. Some of the clerks were unusually attentive, and murmurs among the courthouse staff hinted at a growing awareness that Marcus's case might not remain ordinary. The judge, however, dismissed it. He had built his career on authority and assumed no one could challenge him effectively. Pride had always been his armor. In the evening, Marcus returned home. The city lights reflected off the pavement, and the quiet buzz of traffic created a comforting backdrop. He reviewed the day's events calmly. His strategy was clear: patience, preparation, and timing. He understood that the moment to reveal his position and influence would come, and when it did, it would be undeniable. For now, he allowed himself to rest, to observe, and to wait. At home, he reviewed photographs and documents, making sure every piece of evidence was in place. Marcus had learned long ago that true influence came from meticulous preparation, not from loud declarations. Every case he had prosecuted had taught him this lesson, and now, in his personal encounter with bias, the same principles applied. He felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that fairness would eventually prevail. That night, Marcus reflected on the subtle power of patience. He had faced prejudice before, but each experience reinforced his understanding of strategy. Sometimes, the most powerful response was not confrontation, but composed action that allowed the truth to reveal itself naturally. The judge had exercised authority, but Marcus understood that authority was temporary when faced with facts, professionalism, and the law. The next morning, Marcus arrived at his office with renewed focus. He began preparing for the next phase, ensuring that the review of his fine and case would be thorough, respectful, and undeniable. He coordinated with his team, explaining the legal basis for each document and piece of evidence. Every step was deliberate, every action purposeful. His calm, methodical approach contrasted sharply with the judge's impulsive arrogance the day before. By mid-morning, Marcus had confirmed the submission of the review request. He knew that bureaucracies often moved slowly, but he had seen how even small errors or biases could be corrected when evidence and preparation were strong. He trusted the system, not blindly, but with informed patience. His role as a federal prosecutor had trained him to see beyond immediate appearances and to anticipate outcomes based on careful analysis. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, whispers of the unusual case began to reach Judge Harrison. Staff mentioned the federal position Marcus held, though none dared confront him directly. The judge brushed it off initially, convinced that no single individual could challenge his authority. He didn't yet realize the storm that Marcus's quiet composure had begun to create. Marcus, back in his office, continued his work, fully aware that influence often worked in silent ways. He had not raised his voice, had not demanded justice loudly, but had acted with careful consideration. In his experience, such strategy was often more powerful than immediate confrontation. As the afternoon sun streamed through the office windows, Marcus felt a sense of calm certainty. He knew that when the time came, the truth would speak for itself, and fairness would finally have its moment in the courtroom. The following morning, Marcus arrived at the courthouse early. The air was crisp, and the faint smell of coffee from nearby cafes mixed with the city's usual bustle. He walked confidently through the revolving doors, carrying a leather briefcase filled with neatly organized documents. Today, he would observe quietly, making sure that everything was in order and ready for the next step. His calm, purposeful movements caught the attention of a few courthouse staff, who had begun to notice that Marcus was not just any citizen, he carried himself with an unmistakable authority. Judge Harrison, meanwhile, arrived at his chambers, still unaware of the full extent of Marcus's influence. He believed that the fine had been a simple matter, easily enforced, and that the man he had penalized would quietly accept the outcome. Pride and arrogance, however, often cloud judgment. The judge had spent decades on the bench, issuing rulings and fines, but he rarely encountered someone who refused to be intimidated. The memory of Marcus's composed demeanor lingered in his mind, though he brushed it aside. He told himself that the courtroom had its rules and that no one could escape them. Inside the courthouse, Marcus waited patiently in a quiet corner of the lobby. He had requested an appointment with the clerk to follow up on the review of his fine, and while he waited, he observed the comings and goings of the court's visitors. Parents escorted children to legal appointments, lawyers hurried past with folders in hand, and staff members shuffled papers and files with practiced efficiency. Marcus's sharp eyes noticed details others might miss: a clerk who seemed nervous, a security officer who glanced frequently toward the judge's chambers, and the subtle tension that sometimes lingered in hallways where authority was exercised. Finally, the clerk called him over. "Mr. Marcus," she said politely, "we've received your review request, and it's being processed. However, we have a question regarding some of the supporting documents." Marcus nodded calmly. "Of course. I've brought copies of everything, in chronological order. I'd be happy to clarify any details you need." He opened his briefcase and carefully handed over the documents. Every page was labeled, every receipt accounted for, every form signed and notarized. The clerk looked impressed, taking notes and reviewing each section. "You've been very thorough," she remarked. Marcus smiled politely. He knew that thoroughness was not just a matter of procedure, it was a way to command respect quietly, without confrontation. While the clerk continued to process the documents, Marcus's mind wandered back to the judge. He thought about the previous day, how quickly the encounter had escalated, and how the judge's bias had been so obvious. But Marcus had stayed calm, and that calm had begun to shift the power balance subtly. The judge believed authority came from the bench, but Marcus understood that true influence came from preparation, knowledge, and the ability to act strategically. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison continued his schedule, unaware that the ripple effect of his actions was growing. Small whispers had begun among the courthouse staff, mentions of Marcus's federal position, murmurs of his reputation, and curiosity about how someone could maintain such composure in the face of bias. Pride made the judge blind to these signs. He walked into his courtroom for the next session, confident that his authority remained unchallenged, completely unaware of the quiet storm building outside. Marcus left the clerk's office with everything in order and headed toward a small cafe across the street. He needed a moment to organize his thoughts and plan the next step. Sitting by the window, he sipped a cup of black coffee and reviewed his notes. His strategy was clear: continue to document everything, maintain professionalism, and wait for the appropriate moment to reveal his full position. In Marcus's experience, timing was often more powerful than confrontation. As he sat, he noticed a few courthouse staff walking past, some pausing to nod politely in his direction. These were small acknowledgments, almost imperceptible, but they reflected a growing recognition of Marcus's authority and composure. He did not seek attention, but he understood that respect often followed those who handled challenges with dignity and intelligence. Back at the courthouse, Judge Harrison's arrogance began to show cracks. He had received reports from staff about Marcus's professional background, but he dismissed them, telling himself that a federal position meant little in a local courtroom. He prepared for the next case, speaking confidently to lawyers and witnesses, attempting to assert control. Yet a subtle unease had settled in, a feeling he could not quite identify. The judge was not used to people remaining unfazed by his authority, and the thought gnawed at him quietly. Marcus returned to the courthouse later that afternoon to check on the progress of his review request. The clerk greeted him warmly, noting that the documentation had been carefully reviewed and that everything appeared in order. "Your submission is impeccable," she said. Marcus thanked her politely. Every interaction, every gesture, was deliberate, projecting calm authority without arrogance. By late afternoon, Marcus had returned to his office. He spent the next few hours preparing a detailed letter to the judge, explaining the legal basis for the review and politely requesting reconsideration of the fine. The letter was firm but respectful, emphasizing facts rather than emotion. Marcus understood that the law was a tool, and how it was presented could often influence outcomes far more effectively than anger or confrontation. As he typed, he reflected on the events that had led him here. He had always believed in justice and fairness, not only in his professional work but also in personal interactions. The encounter with Judge Harrison was a reminder that prejudice still existed, even in formal settings. But Marcus also understood that every challenge carried an opportunity to demonstrate integrity, intelligence, and the quiet power of preparation. That evening, Marcus's assistant reminded him of an important meeting with colleagues regarding a federal case scheduled for the next day. He responded calmly, confirming the time and reviewing the agenda. Even while handling personal matters, Marcus maintained focus on his professional responsibilities. His ability to balance personal challenges with professional duties was a key part of his character, and it made him formidable in both arenas. The following day, Marcus returned to the courthouse for a scheduled hearing related to the review request. He entered the courtroom quietly, noting the familiar surroundings. The judge was already present, reviewing papers at his bench. Marcus's calm confidence filled the space subtly, a stark contrast to the judge's hurried, tense movements. Staff members glanced at Marcus as he took a seat, some with quiet admiration, others with curiosity. When the hearing began, Marcus spoke clearly and respectfully, presenting his case with well-organized documents and precise arguments. The judge listened, his expression unreadable, yet there was a noticeable shift in the room's energy. Marcus's composure, knowledge, and professional demeanor left a strong impression, even on those who were neutral observers. As the session concluded, the clerk scheduled a follow-up for further review. Marcus remained composed, thanking everyone and leaving the courtroom with the same calm confidence he had maintained throughout. He knew that the next steps would unfold according to the law and the facts, not the judge's pride. Outside the courthouse, Marcus paused briefly, taking a deep breath. The city moved around him, but he felt steady and grounded. He knew that the judge's initial actions had been hasty, driven by bias, but Marcus's careful preparation and professional reputation had begun to shift the balance. True influence, he reflected, came not from authority alone, but from patience, knowledge, and the ability to act strategically when the moment arrived. The following morning, the courthouse seemed quieter than usual. Marcus arrived early, as always, moving through the halls with calm confidence. He had spent the night reviewing his notes, double-checking every detail, and planning the next steps. The previous days had been a lesson in patience and strategy, and Marcus knew that the most important part of the process was still ahead. The judge's initial reaction had set the stage, but Marcus's quiet authority had begun to shift the energy in the courtroom. Today, things were about to change in a way no one expected. Judge Harrison entered the chambers, slightly more cautious than usual. He could not ignore the whispers he had overheard the day before, the comments about Marcus's professional background, the murmurs from staff about his federal position. Pride had always protected him from doubt, but now a seed of unease had been planted. He moved to his bench, scanning the room with practiced authority, yet there was a subtle tension in his shoulders that was new. His usual air of complete control had begun to crack, and he did not know how to repair it. Marcus arrived at the courtroom and took a seat, placing his briefcase neatly beside him. He noticed the judge's distracted manner but said nothing. Marcus had learned long ago that silence could speak as loudly as words, and confidence could unsettle even the most proud individuals. As the clerk called the court to order, the room settled into a quiet, expectant atmosphere. Lawyers, visitors, and staff all sensed that today's proceedings were different, though none could yet articulate why. When Judge Harrison began reading the case file, he noticed the level of detail Marcus had provided. Every document, every signature, every note was perfectly organized. He flipped through the pages more carefully than usual, realizing that this was no ordinary review. Marcus had anticipated every possible question, addressed every potential issue, and left no room for error. The judge's fingers trembled slightly as he read, a subtle sign of the tension building inside him. Marcus remained calm, standing quietly when called upon. His voice was steady and professional as he explained the purpose of his review request, emphasizing the facts and the law rather than his personal experience. The judge, however, began to feel the weight of the federal position Marcus held. The idea that the man he had found was someone of significant influence sent a shock through him, though he tried to mask it with a professional, neutral expression. As Marcus spoke, the room seemed to grow quieter, every word hanging in the air. Observers noticed the judge's slight hesitation, a break in his usual decisiveness. Marcus had never raised his voice or shown anger, yet the authority he carried was undeniable. It was not just his legal knowledge, it was his presence, his calm demeanor, and the quiet assurance that he belonged there and understood the rules far better than the judge anticipated. After a moment, the clerk discreetly handed a note to Judge Harrison. He glanced at it, and his eyes widened slightly. The note confirmed something he had not fully grasped before: Marcus was indeed a federal prosecutor, someone with direct authority in the legal system beyond the local courthouse. The weight of this knowledge hit him like a cold wave. He had assumed that Marcus was just an ordinary citizen, someone he could find and dismiss easily. Now, the reality of Marcus's power and position sank in. The judge's mind raced. How could he have been so blind? How had he allowed his bias to lead to such a misstep? His pride made him want to deflect, to maintain control, but the evidence before him was undeniable. Marcus's calm, meticulous presentation and professional reputation now overshadowed the judge's previous authority. He could feel the respect, and even the quiet fear, in the room. Staff members exchanged glances, lawyers shifted slightly in their seats, and Marcus remained composed, waiting for the judge to recognize the situation fully. Finally, Judge Harrison spoke, his voice slightly strained. "Mr. Marcus, I was not aware of your position. This changes the context of our discussion considerably." Marcus nodded politely, acknowledging the statement without gloating. He knew that the judge's admission was a step toward accountability. Marcus's approach had always been firm but respectful. He understood that exposing someone's mistake without provocation could escalate conflict unnecessarily. Instead, his goal was to ensure justice and fairness, and to show that arrogance and bias had consequences. The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge continued. "I recognize that my actions yesterday may have been influenced by factors that should have had no bearing on my judgment. I want to review the case carefully, considering all the facts you have presented." Marcus smiled faintly, maintaining his calm composure. He had expected this reaction and was prepared to handle it with the same professionalism he had shown throughout the process. As the judge reviewed the documents again, Marcus noticed a subtle shift in the courtroom's energy. Where there had been tension and anticipation, there was now a cautious respect. Staff members watched quietly, some even whispering about how Marcus had handled the situation without anger or confrontation. Lawyers in the courtroom nodded slightly, recognizing the skill and intelligence required to navigate such a delicate situation successfully. Judge Harrison took a deep breath and looked directly at Marcus. "I admit that my judgment was clouded, and I apologize for the oversight. Your professionalism and knowledge have made me reconsider my initial actions." Marcus responded with a calm nod, his eyes steady. There was no triumph in his expression, only quiet acknowledgement that justice had begun to take its proper course. After a brief pause, the judge spoke again, this time more firmly. "I will ensure that the fine is reviewed and corrected if necessary. Additionally, I will take steps to ensure that such bias does not affect future proceedings in my courtroom." Marcus remained silent, allowing the judge's words to carry their weight. His approach had always been about allowing others to recognize their mistakes, rather than forcing acknowledgement. Today, that strategy was working perfectly. Outside the courtroom, whispers spread quickly among courthouse staff. The story of Marcus's calm authority and professional handling of the situation began to circulate. People admired the way he had managed a delicate situation with respect and intelligence, turning a potentially confrontational scenario into one of learning and accountability. Marcus did not seek attention, but the impact of his presence and actions was undeniable. As Marcus left the courthouse later that afternoon, he reflected on the events of the past few days. The encounter had begun with unfair treatment and bias, but his patience, preparation, and professionalism had changed the outcome. He had remained calm in the face of arrogance, relied on facts and law rather than emotion, and allowed the situation to unfold in a way that revealed the truth without confrontation. The experience reinforced his belief that integrity and strategy were more powerful than pride and prejudice. That evening, Marcus returned home and shared a quiet dinner with his family. He spoke little about the courtroom events, focusing instead on normal conversation and enjoying the presence of his loved ones. For him, the real victory was not in being recognized or vindicated, but in knowing that he had handled the situation correctly and honorably. His family listened with admiration, understanding the importance of his calm, deliberate approach. In the days that followed, the judge took steps to correct his actions. The fine was rescinded, and an official acknowledgement of Marcus's position and professionalism was recorded. Judge Harrison also began attending sensitivity and fairness workshops, recognizing that his previous arrogance and bias had almost caused serious harm. Marcus's quiet influence had initiated change, not only for himself but also for the courthouse system and for those who would interact with the judge in the future. Marcus continued his work as a federal prosecutor, handling cases with the same diligence, patience, and respect he had demonstrated in the courthouse incident. The story of the encounter spread quietly among legal professionals, serving as a reminder of the power of preparation, calm authority, and integrity. People began to understand that true influence did not come from arrogance or intimidation, but from knowledge, strategy, and the ability to act with professionalism in challenging situations. For Marcus, the experience was a confirmation of his principles. He had faced bias directly, handled it without anger, and allowed the truth to emerge naturally. He had not only protected his own rights but had also set an example for the entire courthouse system. The incident reinforced his belief that justice was most effectively achieved when facts, preparation, and integrity guided actions, rather than pride or prejudice. In the weeks that followed, the courthouse slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the atmosphere had changed subtly. The staff, lawyers, and visitors all seemed to carry a newfound awareness. The story of Marcus and Judge Harrison's encounter had become something of a quiet legend among the courthouse community. People whispered about how a calm, intelligent man had managed to confront bias without confrontation and had inspired real change. Marcus's name was mentioned with respect, not just for his role as a federal prosecutor, but for the way he handled himself with dignity and patience. Marcus continued his daily routine with remarkable calm. Each morning, he reviewed his cases carefully, double-checking documents and preparing his arguments. He was methodical, precise, and thoughtful, always focusing on the work at hand rather than past encounters or personal vindication. Yet, the memory of the confrontation with Judge Harrison lingered, not as a source of pride, but as a reminder of the importance of patience and preparation. Marcus knew that integrity was tested not only in ordinary situations but especially when facing injustice. Judge Harrison, on the other hand, found himself reflecting deeply on the events that had unfolded. He could not shake the memory of Marcus's calm presence, the precision of his arguments, and the undeniable authority he carried. For the first time in his long career, the judge began to question his own biases, recognizing that his personal assumptions had almost caused an unfair outcome. The realization was uncomfortable but necessary. Change, he understood, had to start from within. The judge decided to take concrete steps. He signed up for additional ethics and fairness training, attended workshops on unconscious bias, and consulted with colleagues who specialized in judicial conduct. It was not an easy process. Accepting past mistakes required humility, and admitting the influence of bias was difficult for someone who had long believed in their own impartiality. But Judge Harrison persisted, motivated by the awareness that every decision he made affected real people and their lives. In his personal reflections, Marcus considered what had happened to be more than a professional victory. It was a lesson in human behavior, showing how pride and prejudice could cloud judgment and how calm, reasoned persistence could reveal the truth. He understood that power, when used with responsibility, could inspire change without conflict. Marcus knew that his actions would influence others in subtle ways, encouraging fairness and integrity not just in the courtroom, but in life outside it. One afternoon, Marcus returned to the courthouse for a scheduled hearing. The atmosphere was noticeably different. Judge Harrison greeted him with a polite nod, a gesture that now carried genuine respect. Marcus smiled slightly, acknowledging the change without making a point of it. Over time, the interactions between them became professional and courteous, built on mutual recognition rather than tension. Marcus could see that the judge was making a real effort to act with fairness, and he respected that. Outside the courthouse, the story spread beyond the staff and local lawyers. Community members and civic groups heard about the encounter and were inspired by Marcus's example. It sparked conversations about fairness, respect, and accountability in the legal system. People discussed how bias could influence decisions in subtle ways, and how awareness, preparation, and professionalism could help correct it. Marcus's story became a quiet symbol of hope, showing that one person's integrity could influence an entire institution. Marcus also received messages from colleagues in the federal system who had heard of the incident. They admired the way he had handled a potentially confrontational situation with calm authority. Some asked for advice on dealing with difficult personalities and challenging circumstances in their own work. Marcus responded with thoughtful guidance, emphasizing preparation, patience, and the importance of maintaining professionalism regardless of others' behavior. His experience had become a tool for teaching and inspiring others. Judge Harrison continued to make adjustments in his courtroom. He implemented new protocols for reviewing cases carefully, ensuring that every decision was backed by facts rather than assumptions. He began documenting more thoroughly, consulting with peers, and actively listening to opposing arguments before making judgments. The courthouse staff noticed a change not only in the judge's behavior but also in the overall tone of the courtroom. Proceedings became more orderly, respectful, and fair. Marcus's influence had extended beyond a single case. It had sparked a culture shift. Meanwhile, Marcus focused on his federal cases, handling each one with the same diligence and care that had impressed Judge Harrison. He knew that the legal system was full of challenges and biases, but he also understood that his approach, calm, prepared, and respectful, could make a difference. Each case he handled was an opportunity to model integrity and professionalism, and he did so consistently. The courthouse staff and other lawyers observed his work and began to adopt similar habits, recognizing that his example set a high standard. As the months passed, Marcus reflected on the personal lessons from the incident. He realized that patience, knowledge, and calm composure were more powerful than anger or confrontation. His encounter with Judge Harrison had tested his principles, but he had emerged stronger and more confident in his approach to justice. He understood that true authority came from integrity, not position or pride, and that respect was earned through consistent action rather than demands or threats. Judge Harrison also continued his journey of reflection and improvement. He shared his experience with colleagues, acknowledging his mistake and emphasizing the importance of self-awareness in the legal profession. He became an advocate for fairness training, speaking at workshops and conferences about the dangers of bias and the importance of recognizing it before it affects decisions. The judge's transformation was gradual but genuine, and it influenced others who interacted with him in meaningful ways. One day, during a routine hearing, Judge Harrison paused and looked at Marcus. "Mr. Marcus," he said, "I want to thank you again for your professionalism and patience. Your example has taught me valuable lessons about fairness and respect. I hope to continue improving, for the sake of every person who comes through this courtroom." Marcus nodded, appreciating the sincerity in the judge's words. There was no need for further confrontation or assertion of authority. The acknowledgement itself was meaningful. In the broader community, the story of Marcus and Judge Harrison became an example of how courage, preparation, and integrity could overcome bias. Community leaders used it to teach young people about the importance of education, professionalism, and standing up for what is right, even in the face of challenges. Marcus's calm handling of the situation inspired others to address unfairness with strategy rather than anger, showing that change was possible through patience and intelligence. Marcus's family continued to support him quietly, proud of the way he had navigated the situation. They saw how his actions not only affected his own life but also influenced the community and the legal system. At home, Marcus remained humble, focusing on his work and the lessons he could share with others. He knew that the impact of integrity often extended far beyond immediate results and that true change could be slow but lasting. Eventually, the courthouse and federal offices established new programs for fairness and professional conduct training, inspired in part by Marcus's story. Staff members, lawyers, and even other judges participated, learning how to recognize bias, communicate respectfully, and ensure that justice was served without personal influence. Marcus's encounter had become more than an isolated event, it was a catalyst for institutional change, demonstrating the power of professionalism, preparation, and calm authority. By the end of the year, both Marcus and Judge Harrison could reflect on the incident with a sense of accomplishment. Marcus knew he had upheld his principles and helped inspire positive change, while the judge had learned humility and the importance of self-awareness. Their paths continued separately, but the encounter left a lasting mark on both their careers and their understanding of justice. The story ended not with anger or conflict, but with reflection, growth, and the quiet satisfaction of doing what was right. Marcus had shown that patience, knowledge, and integrity could influence even the most unlikely situations. Judge Harrison had learned that pride and bias could lead to mistakes, and that true respect was earned, not assumed. Together, their story became a testament to the power of professionalism, humility, and the courage to stand for fairness. Even as Marcus returned to his routine, handling federal cases and mentoring younger attorneys, he carried with him the lessons of patience and measured authority. The courthouse continued to operate with a renewed sense of fairness, and Judge Harrison's transformation became a reminder that even those in power could learn, change, and do better. The encounter had lasting effects, shaping not only careers but also the lives of everyone who witnessed it, proving that integrity and calm persistence could change hearts, minds, and institutions alike. Marcus often thought about that day, smiling quietly to himself. It had been a challenge, yes, but it had also been an opportunity to demonstrate that justice could prevail without anger, confrontation, or revenge. In a world where bias often goes unchecked, Marcus had shown that one person, armed with knowledge, preparation, and integrity, could make a difference. And in the end, that difference was the most powerful outcome of all.